Hey everyone, welcome back to Population Ecology in our BIOL 105 lecture series. We're now just going to talk about some aspects of real world populations. We've looked at the models, but what actually happens when you go out into the environment? Well, in the top left here, you can see a sort of hypothetical logistic growth equation. Growth, that's what you might get for a bacteria or a yeast growing on an agar plate in a lab. But the reality is that wild populations look a little bit more like this one on the right here, where they fluctuate up and down as they do in the bottom left here, or sometimes even just grow and then crash completely. So why might this happen? Well, reality is that the environment varies. It's an unpredictable place, and so that causes these kinds of fluctuations. So let's think about a few ways that might happen. We're going to look at those density dependent, and we're going to bring back those density independent factors to see how that might be. That last one, of course, is also particularly important, this idea of a crash, and that's because we are worried about that sort of thing. And in particular, we're going to come back to this in our next lecture when we talk about humans. Okay, so population cycles, like those we saw in those dynamic equilibriums, can actually be driven by interaction with other species. And those could be, for example, predators or even diseases. And the idea is that as the prey become more common, there is more food available for the predator, and so the predator's population increases. So what determines predators' numbers here? We look at this graph on the bottom. Rabbits go up. Shortly after, predators go up. Rabbits crash. Shortly after, predators crash. So there's this kind of dynamic that we're seeing. That's best illustrated from 1860 onward, right? Prey up, predators up, prey down, predators down. So predator numbers follow prey. That's pretty important. And interestingly, predators can control prey. What about this population of elk here, or deer? Now you can see that they're fluctuating, but they're kind of sitting around 300. And that's approximately their carrying capacity. Okay, so yes, there's variation, but they're quite stable around the carrying capacity. So what might be causing that fluctuation up and down? That is where we might expect to see something like environmental factors. For example, maybe there's a drought, there's rainfall. You might also get demographic factors, like maybe by chance the population gets a bit too old and there aren't many breeding females, and so there's a bit of a decrease in growth that year and a population decline. There's a whole stack of things that can contribute, therefore. What you may get in some scenarios is what we call overshoot. And this is where populations grow incredibly rapidly to the point where they overstep their own environment's capacity to support them. They then use up all resources and then everyone dies. And this is rare, but it can happen when you have a new population established in a previously uninhabited environment. And what's effectively happening is they're breeding so quickly that new individuals are being added to the population even as the previous population of adults has depleted that grass. So if you imagine a bunch of deer, they get pregnant, but they've used up all the grass. Maybe it's a bad year, there's a drought, and then they all give birth, and there's lots of babies around, and then all of a sudden that depletes all of the grass, and then you see a population crash. That's an example of how that might occur. So, really, is our carrying capacity constant? Well, if you have an overshoot, imagine that grass trying to come back now. All those deer have eaten literally everything down to the roots. It's going to be a lot harder because you've effectively reduced the carrying capacity of the environment by damaging it. Also, we can have this variable environment, which can create noise in carrying capacity. So you can have both physical and biological impacts altering carrying capacity. And guess what other organisms affect carrying capacity? Yeah, they're in the room right now. It is, of course, humans. We can actually both increase and decrease carrying capacity. An example of an increase is kind of like the volume of fertilizers that we pump out into aquatic systems. It's good for some things, bad for others, but we've effectively increased nutrients available and so carrying capacity. But most often, humans are decreasing carrying capacity in the environment. And we're doing that by using up natural capital, for example, deforestation. And if you shrink natural capital, you support small and reduced community complexity, reduced ecosystem function. So we can see that with forests, grassland degradation, degraded soils, reduced fish stocks, and therefore smaller species abundance of animals that eat those fish. And so these are just ways in which humans have overused natural capital. Okay, so our last learning outcomes, we just got two, which are to think about real populations in a bit more detail. First of all, we're going to talk about what we call biotic potential. And this is the idea that some species can grow very rapidly. They've got what we call an R-selected strategy, where they're focusing on the R of the growth equation, quick growth. And then you have some species which grow more slowly because they're focused on what you do when you're at the maximum carrying capacity. There, you don't want to have quick growth, you want to be highly competitive. And so we call those species K species. So if we think about those R strategists, they live at the bottom of our logistic growth equation. They tend to be occurring in environments where there's frequent environmental crashes or very high predation rates, such that basically they're always depressed below the actual carrying capacity. So individuals do well if they have high birth rates or high intrinsic capacity. K-selected species sit at the top. The populations are typically around the carrying capacity, and so there's a lot of competition for resources. And so you need a lot of investment to keep those individuals healthy and strong and able to gain resources against competitors. Okay, so those are our two ideas here. So one of them, environmental instability, density independent effects mean that they're favoring R selection, and then the density dependent effects are favoring K selection on species life history strategies, or they're how they determine their investment and their reproduction and growth. So we build up these things called survivorship curves, which predict which of these two strategies organisms are going to do. So if you're an organism that has a very high risk of mortality, you're a type 3, and a low risk of mortality is a type 1. So if you look along the bottom, it's your age, and this is the number of survivors out of the population. So humans see relatively good survival for a long time, and then we die off. Something like frogs have very low survival of offspring, and then actually they survive relatively well as adults. Most organisms sort of in between these two have sort of in between survival when young and in between survival when old, and so it's more of a linear change. So if we think about the type 3, we call those R selected. They're far from the carrying capacity, so therefore there's good potential for growth. K selected, close, so you have fewer offspring which are more competitive. And then finally you've got the intermediates, halfway house, bit of both. And so if you array them on a spectrum, you can see things with tons of offspring on the R selected side and things with fewer offspring for high investment on the K selected side. So they tend to be longer lived, have more breeding attempts because they're less likely to die. If you're going to die next year, you should just put all your eggs in one basket and breed once, and then you'll probably be dead. So you shouldn't be saving energy to try and stay alive, since something will have eaten you or you'll have died in a storm or whatever. So you just get all your breeding out the way as quickly as possible. That's our continuum. Okay, so that was your biotic potential and how it influences you. Now we're going to talk about demography, population demography. And so populations aren't just a number, they're made up of different individuals, and those individuals are distributed in environment in different ways. So if we think about distribution, that's going to affect how populations behave. You might have different sex ratios, which could affect them. And finally, they might be of different ages, which could affect things. Let's dig into each of these. For distribution, we talk about organisms as either being territorial, where they're uniformly distributed. They might be clumped, either because there's specific resources in one location, or because they have to form groups to avoid predation, or they might just occur on patchy resources, which are sort of indiscriminately distributed in the environment, but in an unpredictable way. So this can inform us about what kind of interaction species are going to be having with one another and how populations might grow, what they might need from their environment. It sort of relates back to their habitat requirements. So responses to competition, vulnerability to changes in group size, and range requirements are important in this context. Take, for example, those passenger pigeons which went extinct because when we depressed group sizes too low, they actually couldn't breed effectively anymore. So we needed to know about their distribution. Here's another example of distribution importance. Sockeye salmon actually breed in our rivers, but they winter in the the Bering Sea up near Alaska and the Aleutians, and then they feed in their summer feeding grounds open ocean in the Pacific. So you need to know what's happening in each of those locations to the population to understand their change. Turns out they're being fished pretty heavily, and that's one of the reasons why they're declining, coupled to factors to do with their own streams here in BC. Okay, so we can find out the vulnerable stages. So let's move to sex ratios next. So you might think that the optimal sex ratio for growth is equal numbers of males and females. Not necessarily. That only applies to species that are monogamous, where you require both parents for successful raising of offspring. Many species have what we call a polygamous mating system. So you've either got one male with a harem of multiple females, or even one female with a harem of multiple males. For example, jacanas do that. They're a type of bird. And so really there you can get away with fewer of one sex than the other. So one-to-one's optimal for monogamous, but in this case with these elephant seals, actually you want to make sure you have more females for optimal population growth. And we see that in the strategy for hunting, in how we choose to shoot more of the stags than we do the hinds for deer, because hinds, which are female deer, are what determine your population growth. But stags mate with multiple females, you don't actually need that many. Okay, so that would be an example of understanding how sex ratio will impact your population growth. Lastly, we're going to talk about age structure. So which of these populations will show the highest future growth rate? Just have a look at those three, right? One's got a bias towards young people on the far left, middle is just an average, and then far right's got a bias towards old people. Well, I can tell you that in the future, the one on the far left is going to have the highest growth rate, right? Because you've got this whole bunch of 0 to 14-year-olds about to age into the reproductive years. So they're going to have tons of kids coming on board. So that growth is going to lead to a bigger population. Should be pretty stable for the middle one. And this one on the right, we can see very few kids. In fact, fewer than are currently in the breeding age. So this population here is going to have lower growth rates in the future. This probably gives you an idea of why people worry about populations and the number of kids that are coming through that population in many countries. So here's some examples of these countries on the far right. Germany, Bulgaria, Italy, and famously Japan all have aging populations, which is leading to a declining growth rate. And that's a problem if you're trying to manage a stable economy when you're losing workers as well, and a smaller pool of workers to generate your economic productivity. Okay. Now that's humans, but it's actually very, very different for other animals. And something we often do is we assume that old individuals are of no reproductive value. That assumption is completely wrong for just about every other organism. And so why might that be? Well, it's because humans undergo a menopause. So we cease reproducing at approximately 40 to 50 years of age. Men can reproduce longer, but typically do not. And so as a result, we perceive young people as generating high growth rates. What about other organisms? Well, actually, in most, your biotic potential, your capacity to produce offspring, goes up continuously with age. So this is a big Atlantic cod here. The bigger the cod gets, the more eggs it can have. And in fact, the more efficient it is at producing eggs. So bigger means better, and older means better because they carry on growing throughout their lives. Likewise, trees. Trees carry on growing. The bigger the tree, the more offspring it makes. The older the tree, the more offspring it makes. And so for most organisms, the older they are, the greater their reproductive potential. And that ideally means you want to have lots of old individuals for population growth. That's not what we think for humans, right? This is even true of chimpanzees. They don't have a menopause. And in fact, young females like this little lady in the top left, they're rather poor at looking after their babies. And so as a consequence, high-ranking, older females who are very good mothers are actually the most attractive for the males. So they're highly sought after as a mating partner. And that's just because they're going to have the highest reproductive potential, best offspring. So this kind of misguided thinking about size and age caused fishermen to target big fish for a long time. We now know you leave the big fish and you catch the small fish, because it's the big fish that make a representative contribution to the number of young in the next generation. And as a result of doing this misguided fishing, we actually selected for cod that started breeding when they were smaller. So we caught all the big cod, which are the best breeders. So any small cod that invested more when they were young and didn't grow quite as big, but instead did more reproduction, they would actually do better from an evolutionary perspective. And so you see declining length sizes in cod because they're having earlier maturation and more investment in reproduction. But remember, smaller cod, less efficient for making eggs. So this actually has reduced the potential population growth rate of the population. That was not maximal sustainable yield thinking. Okay. So they began earlier, natural selection for earlier breeding fish. Unfortunately, that was negative in terms of the maximum population growth rate. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to get you to think about this, and I've actually mislabeled this. I changed the species I want to look at. Think about some southern resident killer whale conservation. So how could we help understand this population better? What we would need to know about the southern resident killer whales in order to understand its population growth potential? Well, if we think about it in the real world, we would want to plot some of the environmental impacts. We'd want to know whether it's K-selected, what's its intrinsic growth rate, but specifically we would want to know the population demographics. So if you can pause and try and identify what those three factors are and maybe relate them to the species the best you could. So assuming you paused, you would probably come up with the three we just covered, right? So we had to talk about distribution and habitat, breeding system sex ratio, and age demographics. So you'd need to know what habitat and where they were and how they're interacting, how that's going to impact breeding. So defining the population areas and how they interact. You need to know the breeding system. Do you need monogamous, equal sex ratio, or will you be okay with just a few males and a larger population of females? And then you need to know whether you actually have enough young females coming into the population, and therefore you can predict the actual future population growth and whether they're on a healthy trajectory or an unhealthy trajectory. Hint, southern resident killer whales are not doing very well, and there's lots of different reasons for that. But at this point in time, we do not have enough breeding females in the population for it to be sustainable. Okay, so that was populations. So to summarize, we wanted to understand how populations change. We introduced the idea of growth rates. We talked about exponential versus logistic growth by introducing the idea of carrying capacity to explain why we don't get exponential growth.